Hello, this is Dr. Stanley Sandler. Continue with our uh, synopsis of World War II. I got up to the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1940, which the country was really split. I mean, you think we're split today? That's true. But in 1940, the question of whether we should aid the Allies or not, well, once France was knocked out, then the question of whether you should aid England, really split the country. But the interventionists, as sometimes they were called, won with Roosevelt. And that kind of seemed to be the East Coast elite. I'm not saying that in a derogatory way, but the urban elite, New York City especially, they were pretty strongly pro-British. And so the aid to England continued. And as I said before, a number of American warships were sunk with our aid going over to England. But so he's reelected. Then in the spring of 1941, Germany invades. They're always invading somebody's country. They invade Greece to save the Italians. Italy had invaded, a lot of you don't know this, Italy had invaded Greece 1939 to 1940 or 41 and were kicked out of Greece. And the Greeks started to invade out and took Albania. So Hitler, who had this kind of soft spot for Mussolini, went in there to Greece to save the Italians. And so he did. It took them about a week or so. Also, the British sent troops into Greece, even though they were hard pressed in North Africa by this time. But they sent troops to Greece, knowing that probably would be lost. And so they managed to evacuate. The British are pretty good at evacuations. They managed to evacuate the bulk of the British forces in Greece. As a matter of fact, some of the British forces, along with the Greeks, fought at Thermopylae. And so I'm thinking some classically educated British officers maybe killed at Thermopylae. And someone said, well, what happened to Colonel so-and-so? He died at Thermopylae. And what was that in 1941? So they were with fairly heavy naval losses, but not too heavy military losses. The British had to evacuate, I think it was 2 divisions out of Greece, and then they finished up Greece in not very long. Interesting here, the Greeks put up a really good fight as they did against the Italians, so I just said. And the Nazis appreciated that. And when the Greeks said to them, look, you guys, you beat us fair and square. So I know you're going to have a victory parade in Athens, but don't have the Italians in the front of the parade. And so the Germans said, okay. And they had them bringing up the rear of the parade. And then also, just before this, I maybe should have spoke this earlier, Yugoslavia was invaded. Yugoslavia had been allied with the Allies, but not actually in the war. Allied with Germany, not allied, sort of treaty of commercial agreement and so on. They broke that and went over to the British, and Hitler was furious. And so he, late on Easter Sunday, the bombing of Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, and just pulverized the city. It's one of the great. I think the guy who organized the raid on Belgrade was hanged as a war criminal after the war. Okay, I mean, it's pretty bad. I mean, a lot of bombing going on, but this guy was actually hanged. Most Yugoslavians didn't know they were at war, and all of a sudden, Easter Sunday, church services, actually a wedding going on. I remember they were blasted right out, and it took about 4 days for the Germans to conquer Yugoslavia. Also, what happened was the Croatians. For some reason, Croatians always felt they were being oppressed by the Serbs. And the Serbs were the dominant government. The Croatians were being held in bondage or anything. But they welcomed, the Croatians welcomed the Germans, and the Germans set up a sort of puppet state in Croatia. Now, all this is, the Germans win again. They're going here, they're going there, invading. But it did slow them down. Their plans were to invade Russia sometime in late April or late May, something like that. So all this, even knocking out relatively weak military countries, compared to Germany anyway, slowed them down. They had to, rearm, refurbish their equipment, everything. A lot of it worn out on the rough roads in that part of the world. So a lot of historians say, if it hadn't been for those 2 expedition sidelines, that maybe the Germans could have gotten to Moscow. But some historians debate that. They say, there's still snow in the passes. This is so typical. That's it, boy, really slowed them down. So we say, well, not really, not that much. So, but I'm saying I think there's a consensus among historians. Well, certainly it slowed them down. Now, how much it slowed them down, it's hard to say, but it certainly did that. And so then when the Germans, and all the time, of course, Hitler, this is a sideline. The main thing is to get Russia, to conquer Russia, the center of Judeo-Bolshevism agitation. And so he, even though, as he had a non-aggression pact. I don't think it's like a formal treaty, but a pact with Stalin, Hitler's Stalin pact, or the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, which Stalin was very careful to keep. That's one treaty he kept because he needed German technical support, and he needed to rebuild his army. He knew eventually that Germany would take on the Soviet Union, but he thought he'd buy time. And often the German photo reconnaissance planes were flying over the border, either into Russia or Russian-occupied Poland, taking pictures. And so the Soviet anti-aircraft people said, let's shoot him down. And he said, don't do that. It's a provocation. We don't want to provoke Hitler, okay? And he also had very little preparation at Hitler. For some reason, he didn't believe that Hitler was coming right at that time. And another reason why he desperately needed time was because he'd shot almost all his really high-ranking staff officers. I think of 4 field marshals, which is the highest rank of the Soviet Union, 3 were shot. And the guy who remained, Vereshilov, was just kind of a token with Stalin, so Stalin spared him contemptuously. But like every other division commander was shot. A real loss was Marshal Tukhachevsky. He was a guy who believed in combined arms war, which is all, the thing today, combined arms, the air power, land power. And he was doing a pretty good job at it. And then Stalin had said, he's getting too big for his britches, and had him shot. Actually, there was the opening of archives just after the fall of the Soviet Union. They found the interrogation records of Marshal Tukhachevsky. There was blood on it. So, I mean, Stalin didn't mess around. And historians still debate, why did he do this? I mean, here, there's a rearming Germany on the border, and Hitler's always down with Bolshevism and everything. And so he goes out and shoots his best generals. Some historians say, well, a lot of these were old Bolsheviks. They had a certain amount of popularity. They weren't all generals either, like Sergei Kirov. A lot of historians think Stalin had him killed anyway, and then that was his excuse for a purge. All these people, they killed my buddy Kirov, whom he may have killed himself. So, and when the German invasion, Stalin really could have had the need of Tukhachevsky. So on June 21st, the early morning hours of June 21st, 1941, the German blitzkrieg rolls into Germany. It's the biggest military operation of all time. I don't know if it's ever been even surpassed by the Allies on the Western Front. It's interesting also what kind of person Stalin is. On the border, the night, like an hour or so before the invasion, or a couple of hours, I'm not sure exactly, the demarcation line between the German and Soviet forces, the River Bug, B-U-G, and a German communist who'd been drafted in the German army, he realizes his comrades are in danger, so he fulfills his socialist duty. He dives in the River Bug, swims across, and look, watch out, the Germans are going to come. And so the border officer, the troops, they radio back to Moscow and say, what should we do? And the guy said, shoot him. He's a provocateur. So the poor wretch was taken out and shot, which tells you something about Stalin. Now, speaking of spies, I got to talk about this too. It's complicated. The Stalin was, in a sense, on a two-front war. Germans or impending war. Germans on the Eastern Front, and the Japanese in the east around Mongolia. Now, in 1939, 40, or 38, 49, 39, Soviet and Japanese troops had clashed along the disputed border. And the Japanese had been defeated. So in Japan, they said, we've never been defeated. They were defeated by the Russians, and pretty badly, under Marshal Zhukov. And the only reason Zhukov wasn't shot by Stalin was, he was a good general. Why didn't Stalin shoot him? He was out in the far east and winning battles. So he survived, and he was very useful to Stalin during the war. But anyway, I was saying, speaking of spies, there was a Soviet spy, Richard Sorge, S-O-R-G-E, in Japan. And he was posed as a Russian businessman doing business with the Japanese. And he was quite a bon vivant, and he could drink almost anybody under the table, especially the Japanese, who apparently couldn't hold their whiskey the way he could. And they started talking, and they say, oh, yeah, and what did the brunt of their conversation of the Japanese was, we're going to head south. I mean, after all, what's in Mongolia for us? I give the Soviets a hard time, yeah, but what's in the south? Oil. The oil of the Dutch East Indies. Oil so pure that you don't even have to refine it to use in bugs. Now, it's better to refine, of course, but this is unlimited supplies of oil in what is now Indonesia. That's what we need there. And also the rice of Burma and the rubber, the tin of Malaya. This is where the real stuff is. And these areas, these countries are colonies. And the Dutch East Indies are ruled by the Dutch, as you may guess. French Indochina, with lots of rubber plantations, ruled by the French. And Malaya, ruled by the British. Now, the Japanese figure, if we move into those territories, the Americans are not going to send their boys to fight for somebody else's colonies. So that's the consensus opinion. The oil, the tin, the rubber, the rice of the South, rather than whatever's in Mongolia. And the Americans won't come into this. But no, I'll leave it right there. So anyway, Stalin does believe that Sorge is not a provocateur. He takes Sorge seriously. So what he does is he says, I think he double tracked the Trans-Siberian by this. I mean, all these about 25 Siberian divisions away from Mongolia across the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Moscow. And by this time, the German, I should go back. It's all taking place at the same time, basically. The Germans rolled over the Soviet defenses because all the good generals have been shot, not just all the way down to practically the colonel, even major level. And so in their place, you had just incompetents, toadies, and suck-ins, and they rolled right over them. The loss of Kiev, which is, I think, the third largest city in the Soviet Union, 650,000 Russian soldiers were captured. It must be the biggest capitulation in history. And of course, those guys had a very sad fate in the German concentration camps, not POW camps like Hogan's Heroes. And Stalin, he couldn't think of any better orders, but hold fast, stand fast, do not yield an inch of Soviet territory, motherland. Although for the first 2 weeks he's not saying anything, he's almost comatose. He could not believe that Hitler, who signed a peace pact with him, would turn on him. And you don't hear his voice for 2 weeks. And so who rallies the Soviet people? Molotov. He gets on radio in Moscow and he says, fellow Soviets, he doesn't say communists. He doesn't say socialists, he say fellow Soviet citizens. We are being attacked by these bestial fascists. Defend the Soviet motherland or defend the Russian motherland. He's appealing to nationalism. He knows that a lot of Russians don't like communism. Certainly Ukrainians don't. They've been through the famine, killing how many people? 4 or 5 million. So he appeals to their national sense, which is probably a smart move because as the Germans move in, they look upon these people as subhuman, Untermenschen, and start abusing them, which is kind of the Nazi tradition. And also, big mistake here, the Ukrainians actually said, look, you Germans are anti-Soviet, so you're on the right track. Get rid of these collective farms, which killed us over the years. And Hitler wouldn't do that. And a lot of historians say, I think rightly so, if he said we're going to abolish these horrible Soviet collective farms and you guys can have your land back, I think he would have lost a lot of support. And what also should be known, and the Soviets never mentioned this, about 1 million Soviet citizens, a lot of whom were Ukrainians, Kalmucks, Tartars, wore German uniforms to fight against the Soviets. Their attitude being, if these guys are anti-Soviet, the Nazis, they must be doing something right. Okay, and they fought alongside the Germans throughout much of the campaign. The German Blitzkrieg juggernaut, that is a combination of tanks with radios inside them, led by airplanes on what their various targets were, of going around mass concentrations of soldiers like in Kiev and surrounding them until they practically starved to death and they could surrender. They move. And they break through Smolensk, Vitebsk, Kiev, and get within close enough. Their forward troops got close enough to Moscow they could see the spires of the Kremlin. They're about 10, 15 miles from Moscow, and that's as far as they got because these these Siberian troops were arriving in Moscow. It was just in the nick of time, as it were. Now, the Germans were complaining, golly, it's 20, 30 degrees below zero. Well, for Siberian and heavy coats and all the 30 degrees below zero is kind of normal. I mean, they're used to 60, 70, 80 degrees below zero. So so they are not bothered by the cold the way and all their equipment also is cold proofed, or the Germans are used to the German cold, which, gets zero and they think it's a real cold snap. And they were hurled against the Germans at the Battle of Moscow. And this is the first land defeat of the Nazis of any size in World War II. The Germans are hurled back about 100 miles. It's quite a defeat, and you could argue it's the most important battle of the war, because had Moscow fallen, then probably it's kind of the heartland of the Soviet Union. Everything probably would have collapsed. We're not sure. There might have been resistance further on, and resistance was developing among the people because of the bestial treatment of the Germans of the Russian people. Even a lot of people who were anti-communist still said, these guys are awful, and we are at least Russians, and we'll fight them. Especially as the Germans get into Russia proper, beyond the Ukraine and Belarus. This is Russia and Russians, and their resistance increases. So the Germans are hurled back about 100 miles in the Battle of Moscow. But look how they got from Poland, the center of Poland, the division of the Bug River, right to the outskirts of Moscow. And now, coincidences. On the very day the Battle of Moscow was started, and of course you got time differences, but either December 7th or December 8th, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and no connection whatsoever between the two. They said, why would they do that? Well, historians this day have been saying, look, you think Hitler's invasion of Russia was dumb. How about the Japanese getting us into the war? They could easily, as I said before, taken those colonies, British, French, Dutch colonies, and we'd protest, the way we protest about the Japanese going into China for no reason, killing millions of Chinese, but wouldn't do anything, cut off their oil. But then they'd have the oil of the Dutch East Indies. But they felt that, well, the Americans will get into the war and then would give us a hard time. And so we should give them a real body blow. And then the Americans would say, well, we will give it up. Little did they understand America. The guy who planned the Pearl Harbor raid, Admiral Yamamoto, had been a naval attaché in the United States in the 1920s and got along very well with Americans. And he said, this is a famous saying, you've awakened a sleeping giant. Once we're going, I'll run amok for about 6 months, but then when these guys get their act together, we've had it, we'll lose the war. And I believe another top Japanese general had his act together, noticed that the Japanese steel production doubled in 1941 or 1942, but American steel production was twice of that of the Japanese, and we were hardly beginning. So he said, we've lost the war, but you dare not say that sort of thing. So you had the warlords, especially in the army, really thought America's decadent. We drink too much Coke, we have it easy, we just drive around in cars everywhere. So every enemy practically underestimates them. We never underestimate enemies, right? The Japanese, they're tough. The Germans, they're tough. But both of them said, the Americans. In fact, Hitler said, I can never believe that the American soldier will make a good soldier. And all he had to do was look at his from World War I, saying the Americans made every mistake in the book because they're wrong, but they're brave and hard fighting. But I guess he wouldn't bother with facts like that. So both of our allies drastically underestimated us and paid a very high price for it. But in the meantime, Pearl Harbor, of course, the greatest single defeat that we've ever suffered. All of the battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor, and then the loss of the Philippines, which I'll get into maybe later. However, on the very day of Pearl Harbor, the war was lost for the Japanese in many ways, because first of all, they sank a number of elderly battleships. Like the Arizona was just blown right, and the greatest single naval loss we ever suffered, single ship loss. And then the battleship Oklahoma capsized, also a heavy loss of life. There was the demilitarized battleship Utah. They said it died of fright. It seems just opened up and it sank. But they did not sink the aircraft carriers. As we all know, the carriers were delivering aircraft to Wake Island, and so they missed that. And that is what is going to determine the future of the Pacific War. Also, they did not hit the oil tank farms, so we had oil. Still, we could go after the Japanese, and also the machine shops for repairs. So in a way, the Japanese, this is a wonderful air strike they had 6 aircraft carriers. I mean, we had like 4. But they're still thinking about battleships. Let's sink those battleships. Well, they weren't even new battleships. The new battleships like the Washington and North Carolina were just getting fitted out now. In fact, we built no new battleships in World War II, but a fair number of them were built in the 1930s. Some just as make-work projects, put people to work building battleships, okay, plus other ships. And So, but they were not there. Okay, so the action really is aircraft carriers, but we suffered and of course everybody's, how could the Japanese possibly have done it? Just again, things going wrong, somebody asleep at the switch, an officer sees on the radar, the one of two radar sites they had at Pearl Harbor, this large number of aircraft coming in. He saw that's the those aircraft carriers aircraft flying back, and the other his NCO says, "Boy, I've never seen so many aircraft in my life." That going lunchtime, they closed down the set and went to lunch, things like that. I dare say the officer was busted, right? I know that the NCO that said, "Look out, this is bad," got a battlefield promotion, but it was a terrible disaster. And the two Admiral Kimmel and General Short were basically relieved of their posts and court-martialed. But there are still people who say they were not that negligent, but why they didn't send their patrols out further. I mean, and Short believed the major problem was all those Japanese in Hawaii. Boy, they're one of their tricky characters, and they're going to dynamite our aircraft. So he put the aircraft all close together, more easy to watch them, which made it easier for the Japanese planes to shoot them up. So it really was a fiasco. And but here's the thing: it was bad enough to really get us angry. I mean, we were PO'd, but not enough to really hurt us. Sinking a lot of battleships. That's unfortunate, especially the loss of life. But it's like under 3,000 died, and I'm not going to minimize the casualties. But nonetheless, it did not really affect our ability to rebuild with personnel. And even all the battleships that were sunk, they're still useful for shore bombardment. They were raised, except for the Arizona and the Oklahoma. The Arizona is still there, as you know, it's still on active duty, as it were, with the U.S. Navy. And the Oklahoma was righted and cleaned out and everything, but they felt just too much work to do. It's not worth it. We got new battleships coming down the line. So there's only really one permanent capital ship that was lost at Pearl Harbor. So it's really, blunders and mistakes on both sides all the way. The Japanese to do it in the first place. I mean, again, we're not going to go to war to defend the Dutch East Indies or Malaya, but we would go to defend the U.S. territory of Hawaii. It wasn't a state at that time, and to avenge the loss of Americans. And the recruiting offices were swamped with people just fighting to get into the recruiting offices and join the military. Okay, terrible mistake. However, this was the opening of a series of the most but the most serious defeats the United States and Great Britain have ever suffered militarily. And I'll talk about the next time we get together. Thanks for listening. Bye.